Hey everyone, this is going to be a relatively short tutorial largely on blending modes, which has to do with when you're compositing footage and layers together, how they overlay and how After Effects combines them to make them hopefully look like they're part of the same original clip and they work together the way that you want. And there's some different ways you can do this. If you go to our Canvas site, there is a link under external tutorials on the video tutorials page to blending modes. And this is not a video. This is going to kind of show you still picture examples of what these different blending modes look like. So they kind of started with these two clips and then show, okay, when we do all these different things, how do they end up looking relative to each other? And you can kind of see how they combine. This is a really helpful resource, so I definitely suggest you take a look at that. What I want to do here is show you in an actual project how some of that might be useful to you and how you can play with these and think about combining them. This is going to be similar to part of one of your homework assignments, and I'm going to use some very similar footage. It's not quite the same shot you have, but something that will look very similar to it. So hopefully this will be helpful in that as well, but also just trying to get at this general principle of how we're combining layers and putting them together. To this point, mostly what we've done is sort of put one thing on top of another and left it there, or maybe in a couple cases, adjusted the opacity so you're seeing parts of both kind of showing through each other. Blending modes give me a lot more control over exactly how things are combining, and that's what I want to share here. So let's start with a clip that, like I said, looks similar to something you were working with for one of the homework assignments. Just this clip outside Blanton here, and the shot that you have for the homework assignment is a tighter shot than this. In one of the assignments, it's kind of just this frame here, and the other it starts up here and pans and tilts down to this. And what I'm going to do here is similar to what the homework assignment is. I'm just going to kind of dirty this up. And in fact, we'll kind of focus in on here on this sign and just try to deface this a little bit and make it look a little more worn and beat up, like it's been there a long time and seen some damage. So you have a bunch of textures available to you. These were all in a zip file, so you should have access to all of those. And I'm going to start by just looking at these grunge textures and seeing I got some different things I can use. And really, any of these could be useful in this assignment. I think this is a pretty good group of textures for what this particular homework is. I'm going to just start with a simple sort of crack texture here, this sort of crack concrete look I think I can maybe do something with on that sign. So let me just bring that into my After Effects project. I could drag it in, or I could do, file, import file, or Command I. Okay, and I've got this in here, and I'm just gonna put this into my composition. And it's really big right now, so I'm gonna have to scale it down. And let me start by, I'm just gonna temporarily lower the opacity here so I can kind of see through it and see what I'm looking at. And I wanna kind of lay it over this concrete part in front of the bricks here, and we're just gonna mess with that in the current case. And let me rotate it 90 degrees. Whoops, that was 90 times around. We don't want to do that. Let's rotate it 90 degrees because I kind of like that horizontal crack running right through it. And let's kind of put it over here. I'll scale it down just a little bit more. And actually, maybe I don't want that crack running exactly 90 degrees. Let's do like a little bit of an angle on it. Something like that. Okay. So I've kind of laid over there now. And we'll have to see how this looks at this scale. It might be with the scale of the cracks and stuff that we want it a little larger or a little smaller. Actually, let's do this even a little bit less. All right, that should actually work pretty nicely. Okay, and I'm also going to, while I still have this opacity down, put a mask on here, because again, for purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to ignore the brick. That's something on your homework assignment you can do more and play with more areas of this, but for this I'm just going to try to tackle this concrete slab here. Let's give it a little bit of a feather on that mask so we don't get super hard edges. Can always go back and play with the details of that later. Okay, and let's put the opacity back up. Okay, so what I've got here now is this sort of cracked stone rectangle here. And I have the original footage. And you'll notice it looks a little pixely low res because I'm zoomed way in on this shot. Remember, this is coming out of this much larger shot here. So it's fine if it looks a little pixely when I'm zoomed in. And what I want to do is not what we've done so far, which is just sort of overlay this and replace it. Or even if I do sort of opacity here and change it so I can see both of them, this isn't really the effect I want. I sort of have this partially transparent cracking and this partially transparent sign in the back. And what I really want it to do is look like this cracking is part of the sign itself. And so this is a place where I can go and play with some layer modes. So there are ways you can access this in the menus. I can go to my layer and go to blending mode, and I can see all the various options here. But there's also a way I can access this down here in my timeline. There's this button on the bottom. It says toggle switches modes. You can see this right down here at the bottom. And when I click on that, it's going to switch from what we have been looking at to this other view. And let me zoom back out here. And this is the view that we've normally been used to. Kind of seeing, is this layer hidden? What's my render settings? Is this 3D? All this sort of thing. If I switch this, you can see now I get information about the blending mode it's in and if it's being used as a track matte, which we'll look at a little bit later. And by default, these come in at normal. So let me just take a second here and switch my opacity back to 100%. I want the full sort of cracking there. And you can see I have these same options that were up here in the menu. And all these things have to do with how these layers are combining. How is this layer combining with what's beneath it? And that page I pointed to on Canvas, or where it's linked on Canvas, is an external page where it shows demos of all these, is a great place to look and read and kind of understand what these are doing and how they relate. But something you can also do, and I would recommend doing if you haven't played with these much, is actually just play through some of them and see what happens if I do add. Okay, that doesn't look right. What happens if I do, let's do another one that's not going to look right. Color dodge. Right, and so you can play through these, and if you do them on a few different things, you'll start to get a sense of what they're doing. So for instance, the reason add doesn't work is add is basically taking the values of this shot, so whatever the sort of brightness and color values are here, and it's adding them to the brightness and color values from this. So basically everything's getting a lot brighter because I'm taking anything that has any brightness here, adding any brightness from the other one and putting them together. In this case, that's not going to look great for us. Now, if I go to darken, I'm getting something that maybe looks a little more promising. And here you can see the image, instead of getting brighter, is getting darker. It's definitely keeping this dark crack showing through there. And I can see this other text going through there. If you look at the description of darken, it's going to be a subtractive mode. Here. Yeah, look at both layers and choose the darker of the layers. So in this case, for something like this, this might actually work out okay for me if these were both pretty sharp images, because it's going to look at it and say, okay, the background texture here is pretty similar. Got sort of concrete there and concrete here. And where there's things sort of cut out of the concrete, so these sort of etched in letters or these cracks, I want those to kind of dominate and like make sure these cracks come through. The challenge here is that because this original image is actually a little bit brighter, so there's actually kind of more light on the concrete than there was here, you can see when I use the darken, there's some places where just kind of cuts out that lettering entirely, because just the plain concrete here is actually darker than even the cutout letters here. So we could play with some other things and see if we could maybe find something that works a little better for us. I can play with a few of these. And you can also just get a sense of what these do. So this is part of it, is I wanted you to see where these are and how you adjust them. You know, that's not bad. It made the whole thing darker, but then I could, you know, pre-compose this and put a adjustment layer on here to brighten that back up if I liked something like that. I think I'm actually going to go back with the darken And what I'm going to do is just take this texture. I'm going to go to my curves. And I'm actually going to try to just brighten up this image a little bit so it matches more with what the lighting is and the sort of overall brightness is of my original shot. So maybe do even a little bit more, something like that. And my original shot doesn't actually have a lot of real black. It kind of has things down in the gray. So I'm picking this, raising this whole level here a little bit. We go with something like this, and that's not bad. Now I'm getting somewhere that I can actually work with. Now it's starting to look, particularly if we kind of zoom out here a little bit, starting to look like that crack is actually running through the sign in this shot. And obviously we could spend some more time tweaking it. We could work on our masking and make sure that looks exactly right, but something like that. So this is the idea of blending modes, is I'm not just seeing one thing, I'm not just seeing the other, but playing with how it is combining those two. So in this case, now that I've got the two layers, more or less overall brightness and black and white levels the same in terms of this concrete. Now what it's doing when I select darken is for each pixel, it's looking at what is the darker of the values there, and it's going to take that. So in the case of like where I'm putting in this crack, anytime the crack is there, it's the darkest thing, so it's kind of eradicating whatever else was there and putting in that crack. Meanwhile, when I have these engraved text where most of the places I want to leave that there, it's doing the same thing. And taking that becomes the darker element, and so it's leaving that there. So I get this thing where this actually starts to look more like it is integrated together in one place. And you can see, because the lighting changed a little bit, probably I'd actually need to do this as two separate layers. Let me demo this quick. And I'm going to take this top one and bring its mask in just over here. And I want to adjust its curves because that side is a little bit darker. So let's just darken that up a little bit and feather this a little bit more. And you can see what I'm doing is just trying to bring back a little bit more over here where this was kind of getting faded out a little bit. Let's bring down some of those brights a little bit too. So just bring up a little bit there, and you could obviously play with this a lot more, but that's the idea. And remember, you have all these different blending modes to play with, and there are those descriptions again in this page on here where you can go and read what they all do, and that's helpful. I did like this note. Multiply is one of the more commonly used ones. And just if we want to see how that works here, in contrast to darken, I'll go to multiply. And you can see in this case, it works in terms of making them look like they're part of the same thing. We've definitely darkened out a lot more relative to what the original footage looks like. So that might be something you'd have to decide if you want this, or you could go in and color correct that. I actually think for this particular footage and the way we're handling it, I think darken worked a little better. But you get the idea. And you can play with those and adjust these. And this is there for any sort of video or still image layer. We'll have a blending mode and we can play with how it's being put in there. So let's take a look at another thing. We're supposed to kind of have this sign on fire. So, because why not? Let's take a look at some of these stock fire clips, and these again are provided for you on Canvas. You can download them in a zip file. I kind of like that one. It's a little more subtle. Okay, I think for purposes right now, I'm just going to grab this one, number 2. And right now it's just kind of floating in there in the middle of everything. So again, I'm going to start by just kind of getting it roughly where I want it. Let's scale that down a little bit and move it kind of down here. It's supposed to be that the sign is on fire. Scale it down a little bit more. Okay, so something like that. And what I'm actually going to do here is, again, depending on how I want it to look, and I could play with this, I don't really like how this is kind of hanging down in front here. The particular angle that the camera's at, I kind of want it to get cut off here, like it's just on the very top of this, or maybe coming from behind, and we're not seeing this overlap. So we know how to do that. I'll just throw a little mask layer on here. And I don't have to be really precise about the top. Really what I'm trying to do is cut off the bottom here. And then I could spend some time and adjust this and make sure it is sitting exactly where I wanted. Oops, I'm going to go the other way. Let's go like just maybe half a degree. Get it kind of sitting there and up a little bit. And maybe feather my mask just a hair on this. I don't want to feather it too much. If I feather this a lot, we're really seeing that kind of bleed down here, but I don't want that super hard edge there. So again, I'm just gonna give it a tiny little bit. That might even be too much. Let me just give myself like 5 pixels worth. Okay, something like that. Again, we could spend some more time getting it precisely how we wanted. That's not bad. That thing's kind of smoking on fire there now. And let's get some smoke in there too. Again, there's some smoke effects you can grab up here. And I think maybe this puffy smoke too I'm going to grab. And throw that on here and do the same kind of thing. Let's move that up and scale it down a little bit. Okay, now this actually has a hard edge on the bottom because it's actually coming from below the frame edge in the original stock footage. So I could use that bottom edge. I want to maintain just a little bit of control over this. So I'm going to go ahead and put it close up to here, but then I'm going to use a mask again so that I can get, a little bit of feathering on the bottom if I want to. And I may or may not want to. I'll have to decide that. But I want to make sure that I don't end up being kind of stuck with that hard edge. And in this case, I'm going to make sure my mask goes all the way up past the top of the screen, just because if that smoke is going up here, I don't want a mask to be kind of cutting it off at the end. So now I've got this fire here and the smoke, and maybe I should have flipped one of these because the smoke's kind of going in the opposite direction of the fire. Maybe I layer a couple of smoke layers on top of here. Okay, so now let's look at my blending modes for this stuff as well. Let's start with the fire. So you can see it looks pretty bright here as is. That's in my normal mode. If I go to add, we would expect it to get brighter, because now we're saying add the brightness of the fire to the brightness of whatever was already behind it. And you can see that does get bright. We actually get some areas sort of blowing out here where it was already pretty bright behind it, and then the fire's pretty bright. If we go to darken, this is probably in this case not going to do what we want, because it's saying take whatever's darker, and most of the time the background is going to be darker than the fire, so we don't see any of the fire. So we can try and multiply. It said that was a good one, but in this case, again, that's not really what we want. I don't want to sort of combine the brightness values of that with the brightness values of the fire and do those in relation to each other. Most of the time, I think I probably want to keep the brighter thing, which is probably the fire. So I could try lighten and see what that looks like. That might look okay. That's still a little bit bright. Could try screen, and screen is, again, if I go back to my tutorial over here, I think this is a good description. Essentially replicates projecting multiple photos onto a single screen. And so here it kind of is keeping the fire, so I'm definitely seeing some of that, but I'm also seeing some of the background kind of through it more as well. So this is like a little more subtle compared to when I had normal and it was this pretty bright orange fire. Now, I'm not necessarily saying this is bad. That might be an effect you want to go with. That looks, to my eye, a little more intense than I think I wanted. I kind of like this where I'm seeing through that background a little bit more. So those are ideas of blending modes. Again, there are a whole bunch of different things here you can do. There's some ones that I also think are kind of weird, the exclusion and divide and stuff that are useful in particular scenarios. Most of the things, if you're really just doing sort of straight up compositing, putting multiple layers of footage together and just kind of adjusting how you see the combination of the two, it's going to be these top ones are most of the time what you're going with. These are going to be, in my experience, more for sort of specific scenarios where there's something particular about what the footage is or how the way you want it is to look, as opposed to quote unquote normal footage that you're just all trying to combine. So these sort of top categories here, the normal, dissolve, dancing, dissolve, the darken categories, and the add categories are where I would start and play with these. Now, I do want to point out there is a keyboard shortcut, grab a layer here, for next blending mode, which is Shift equals. And as you're first learning this, this can be a really handy thing to just go through. So if I hold down Shift and equal, it's just going to kind of scroll through all these different blending modes and I can kind of see how they look. So I'm looking at a frame here and going through all these. So here's linear lighting, which again, this looks pretty bizarre. This is one I said isn't one of those ones I'd normally use. But I can go through all these and really see what they do. You can start to get a sense of how they're behaving. Let me get back to, okay, there's my normal mode, and kind of go through some of these more common ones. There's my dissolves. Darken, remember I said is not going to be a good choice for the fire. There's multiply, color burn. So none of these subtractive modes are really great with the fire, but when I get to the additive modes, I have some options. The add looks okay, lighten looks okay, screen looks okay. But it's just a quick way to toggle through these and get a sense of all the different ways you can combine layers together. So that's definitely something that I would recommend playing with as you're first learning this. And this is a great exercise to do this on. I can do the same thing with my smoke. So let's just find a section where there's a chunk of smoke there. And right now this is being combined normal. And once you start to get the hang of these, you could start to think, what do I really want to do? So for instance, if I go with lighten, that's basically going to say, take any place where the smoke is brighter than what was behind it and just show the smoke. Any place where whatever was behind it is brighter than the smoke, just show that. So that's probably not going to look really good for me. You can see that kind of doesn't really look like what we would want it to. Same thing with darken. I definitely don't want to just take the darker color, because any place where the background was sort of darker than the smoke, I'm not going to see any of the smoke. So again, I might try things like screen, see what that does. I might try my multiply, see what that does. Or again, if I'm just learning, I'll go up to normal here and then I'll just sort of shift equals through a bunch of these and see what their effects are. And in this one, I honestly kind of like the screen mode and the normal mode. I like how kind of both of those look. I'm just actually going to set this back to normal because I kind of liked how that went. And it also is going to make a difference whether the fire is in front or the smoke is in front. So you'll want to think about things like that. I think I actually want the fire in front to bring that out a little bit more. But now that the smoke is behind it, I might need to play with my modes a little bit. And I could try some things again and say, hey, actually, is screen still the best mode for me if the smoke is behind it? You do add and get a really, really bright, because now I'm adding some of that whiteness of the smoke to the brightness of the fire that's already there. And that's actually not bad in this shot. I kind of like that. We lost some of the color saturation, but the brightness kind of works with what's already a shot that has some oversaturated parts. So I can play with all those sorts of things. And I think where I had this on before was screen, and that's a little more subtle effect, but I think, still probably works for us. Doing something like that. Okay, so at this point we've got some damage here. If we wanted to add some more damage, we could. You'll see in addition to these textures, there's some other things. You've got some burn marks, some bullet holes. You can sort of destroy things as much as you'd like, a whole bunch of other textures and such you can work with. I'll leave that to you for the homework, but I do want to show you one more thing related to layer combinations and related to blended modes, but slightly different, and that is this track matte option that you see down here. So here are our blending modes, here's our track mattes. And the idea of this is to use one layer as a mask for another, more or less. So in this case, I'm going to copy something that we did on the billboard project, which is we've got this fire here, some heat coming up, and so I'm thinking that probably there should be some kind of heat distortion here, the same way we saw above the highway. And right now I've got nothing. I've just got this smoke and fire, but it's not changing how we're seeing anything. And maybe that's normal, but I want to be a little more ambitious and have, let's say this fire's burning really hot and I want to have a little bit of heat distortion above here. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to make a version of this background that is distorted. So I'm going to duplicate this layer, and I'll take this one, and I'm going to use one of the several options for doing this sort of heat wave distortion that you might have looked at on the billboard project, and I'm going to just do Turbulent Displace because I like that one. Okay, and for the moment, I'm going to do a really large amount of this just so we can see the effect, and then obviously we'll dial it back down to something more reasonable. And I need to have it change over time, so let's just do the evolution and make a keyframe there, and make a keyframe there. Okay, so we can see it is changing over time now. And the issue though is I've done it for the whole image, so I only want to do it for part of the image. Now, something I could do here is just put a mask on this layer that I made here. And so I could just sort of mask out this and say I want to see the distorted stuff here, not in the rest of the image. That looks pretty frickin' weird though. So I could tweak that. I could mess with exactly where this is. I could mess with the mask feathering and such and probably make that look okay. And what I'm going to do is essentially end up with a very similar result here, but I want to show you a different way of combining layers because this is something that can be useful in other scenarios using these track mattes. So I'm going to delete the mask out of this layer here. So just got the whole thing. And I'm going to say instead what I want to do is use another layer as the mask for it. So I'm going to make myself a new layer, and in this case I'm just going to make a black solid here, and I'm going to put a couple of masks on. And I'm going to do this in a way that creates some problems first and show you why this creates some problems, and then I'll show you a way that we can fix this. But let's just make this, and we'll feather this mask as usual, and I'll give this a good amount of feathering. Actually go even more than that. Okay, a lot of feathering there, and let's have this going. Actually, maybe not quite all the way up because I'm going to assume this heat's kind of dissipating as we get up, so maybe there's a little bit less here at the top. Okay, so I've got this black solid here now, and just so you can see what that is. It's got this here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell After Effects to use this black solid, this layer here, as the mask for how much of this layer I see. And that concept is straightforward. I will say I personally always end up having to do a little trial and error because just getting the things in the right order and making sure you're selecting the right thing is sometimes a little tricky. What I want to do is have it in this order. So I'm going to have, here's my background layer, kind of the thing I always want to see, the main background. In front of that is the layer that I want to show part of. And then in front of that is going to be my mask. So I'm going to use this as the mask. And what I'm going to do down here, even though this is the mask, down here, I'm going to go to Track Matte and say, I want to use Black Solid 3, this layer that's my mask, as a mask for this layer. And the cool thing here is it doesn't have to be, a black solid I created, because this I could have just done with masking, but it could be a layer that is changing over time. It could be another visual layer and use the sort of brightness or something as it. In fact, I can show you an example of that in a second after we see how this would work. So in this case, I'm going to use the alpha matte. So Luma Matte would be use the brightness of that original layer as the mask. In this case, I actually already set up masks on that black solid layer, so I want to just use the alpha from it. In this case, I think I'm going to end up wanting the alpha inverted, but I'll do alpha matte first. Oh, that actually did work. Okay. Like I said, always takes a little trial and error for me. And you can see what it's doing here now is it's using this layer, this mask I created here, to show what parts of this to reveal. So, and yes, this is super imperfect right now. We're going to have to clean it up, but you're only seeing that distortion in this area where that mask was, and otherwise it's seeing through to this. So this is a way to use one layer as a mask for another. So basically whatever I have as a layer, I could turn into a mask using this. Real simple example of this would be an effect you've probably seen places. Let's just say we had some text here. Okay, I'm going to put that down here towards the bottom. And I'm actually going to use that text as a mask for this video. So I only see the video through where that text was. So I'm only seeing this bottom layer here through where the text was. So that's the idea of this. Let's turn this back to normal and take this off. Okay, so that's the concept of a track matte and how it works. While we're in here, let's do a quick little bit of cleanup on this. So one thing that's bugging me is we're actually seeing, because there's so much feathering on this mask, we're seeing this distortion way down here, and I don't actually want it there. So I'm going to take this mask and we're going to kind of start it higher. And if I was really clever, I might do some kind of a gradient or something here. What I'm actually going to do is start this one pretty high with a lot of feathering, so just get a little bit. I'm going to make another mask down here a little lower. That has a little less feathering. Okay, and then down here towards the bottom, I'm going to make a mask without much feathering at all. Just pretty low here towards the bottom because I want to get that heat distortion pretty strongly here, but I don't want it to bleed down and actually be getting in the way of this. So I'm going to do one that kind of just gets this very bottom here. And that's it, without much feathering at all. Just a tiny little bit so we don't get a hard edge, because I don't want to see, you know, the edge of the actual cement here distorting. I just want to distort the stuff above it. And I've left myself a gap here, so let's do one more mask in between the two of those. And we'll do this somewhere in between. Maybe I'll give like 80 pixels of feathering there. Okay. The other thing I obviously need to do is this distortion is ridiculous. So let's bring the amount of this way down. Let's bring the size of it way down. Okay. And, you know, something more like that now. That's probably still a little much, but you see the idea is we're getting just that little bit of kind of heat wave distortion above the smoke, making it look a little bit more like this fire is actually affecting the air above it. And, you know, you could tweak these and figure out exactly how much you need. But if I sort of drag this through, you can see there's that just a little bit of waviness there. All right, that's probably still a little much. Kind of rule of thumb on these things is you kind of get it kind of right where you would notice it and then dial it back just a little bit from there, because I really want this to be a pretty subtle effect that just adds a little bit to the reality of it but isn't distracting us. So something like that. Here, if I play this back in real time now, it's just that little bit of distortion on it. So anyway, that would be, I do something like that, but that's the idea of using these track mats. So I can take any layer and turn it into a mask for something else. And I have two ways I can do that. Remember, one is the alpha matte, so it's going to go based on what is transparent in the original layer that I'm using as a mask. The other thing is Luma Matte, which would be use what is bright. So wherever there's brightness in the original, I will use that. And let me show you an example of something that you might try for this that's kind of a cool idea. It would take a lot more work to actually get it working correctly. So let me turn this off for a second. I'm going to ignore this black solid layer, and I'm going to make another layer of my smoke and say, well, what if I just said, you know, wherever there's smoke, I want that to be my mask. So just kind of seeing through the smoke is where I have this hazy, distorted stuff. And again, I'm going to crank up the distortion on this just so it's really obvious when we're seeing any of that distortion. Right now we're seeing it in the whole image, of course, because I don't have anything set as the mask. So I've got my smoke layer here. I duplicated it. So here's my original smoke. I just made another copy of it. And I could go here. Remember, I have to have the mask layer immediately above and say, hey, use that smoke as the mask for me. And in this case, part of that layer is transparent. It has an alpha channel, so I could try using the alpha. And you see it's kind of working. The stuff where I'm seeing here behind is where it's getting distorted. The problem is because that smoke is always sort of partially transparent. It's not fully transparent or not. Like I'm always seeing a little bit through it and a little bit not. I'm going to end up getting this overlay where I'm seeing my distorted image there kind of mixed in with the original image, and this does not look natural at all. This could be a very cool effect if I wanted something like this. You know, it looks like we're in a dreamscape or hallucination or something, but kind of seeing that overlay does not look very natural. Now I could try to play with this. So I could pull up my puffy smoke layer here and go to my effects and say, okay, well, something I could try to do is make this sort of, instead of all being partially transparent, make it so it's fully transparent or fully not transparent. And that way I won't get that sort of weird mingling of the distorted image and the non-distorted image. So I could try something like curves and throw that on here. And what I'm going to do is kind of push this to the extremes so everything is either transparent or not, and I don't get these areas that are sort of partially transparent, because that's what was causing me my trouble. And I'm not going to push it all the way. We could try something like that and then go back to our image and see how that has affected it. Not much. I've still got some transparency issues here. And that's because I was adjusting the red, green, and blue. Let's adjust the alpha channel instead, which I'm doing that in my curves. And so now I'm not getting that sort of overlay. The issue is I'm sort of getting a clean break where there's areas with no distortion, areas of a lot of distortion. And this is going to look kind of equally unnatural if I actually play it through. As you can see, everything sort of all the way alpha or all the way not alpha. Now, maybe if I actually dial this down to a reasonable level of distortion, that might actually end up looking okay. If I go with a very small amount of distortion, let's go a little more so we can pick it up. That's actually not so bad. I probably could get away with that. I think the other way is a little better because part of it is, you know, there's these flames over here. I still want to get that heat distortion above those, not just where there's smoke. So I think the first way I did it with the mask kind of works, but you can see how the same sort of thing can be used. And we're getting just sort of distorted areas where the smoke is. And that's another example of using a layer So in this case, using where the smoke is to cue, hey, where do I get this distortion behind it? And that's the idea of the track map. You could also use the Luma channel, which is how bright it is, which since I cranked up the brightness as well as the alpha channel, probably still would be getting, I think I'm past my keyframing here. Would still be getting the same thing. We're still getting that distortion. You can see this lamppost here wobbling a little bit behind the smoke, and that's because I pulled up the curves on here to really make these things sort of like bright white or black, so I don't get that. If I go back to kind of what it originally was, using this Luma Matte, I'll start to get a little bit of that blending of things. And again, I need to make this bigger for some of that to show up. Oh, that looks really weird. Oh, right, because I have the on. So obviously that's too much distortion. You're still seeing a little bit of that blending around the edges, but this isn't bad. So again, I could do this with the smoke and make it work, particularly at normal levels of distortion instead of cranked way up like this. But I liked it better when I was getting some of that heat wave distortion above here as well. And if I wanted to get really fancy with this, you know, I could stagger multiple layers of this and have sort of more heat wave distortion down here close to the fire, and then a lower level up here, and make that happen. But you get the general idea. So that's the concepts for this. Remember, I can toggle these from my normal switches here where I had my 3D switch and turning my effects on and off and the show hide layers option, or I can switch here and see my blending mode and whether I'm using any track mats. And again, lots of different options here in blending mode. My shortcut to toggle through them was Shift equals, and you can just sort of roll through them all and see what they're doing. And lastly, as I'm leaving here, just a reminder, you always want to look at your whole shot before you output something, because I was working in the early segment of this. And if we notice later on here, my smoke has actually gone off to the left edge of the frame. Is now I can kind of see a hard line where my mask is, and also is now like I've got this weird hard edge where the smoke is now extended beyond the limits of this. So again, I'd want to be more careful if I was actually going to use this clip to find what section of the smoke I use and make sure it looks okay for the whole length of the shot. But that's our tutorial for today, and good luck with this homework assignment.